Hello and welcome to the Squiggly Careers podcast. I'm Sarah, one of your hosts, and this episode is part of a special series that we've created to bring to life some of the ideas and insights in our new book, You Coach You. In this series of 6 episodes, we'll be talking to experts to get their thoughts on how we can help ourselves through some of the knottier moments in our squiggly careers. It might be coping with challenging relationships at work, feeling overwhelmed, or perhaps your progress has stalled, or maybe figuring out how to find more meaning from the work that you do. Every episode relates to a chapter in You Coach You, and today we're focusing on our resilience chapter. And we've got someone who is absolutely brilliant talking about resilience. He was recommended to me, I think in 1 week, by 3 different people, which is always a good sign, and he absolutely didn't disappoint. Today you're going to hear me talk to Dr. Bill Mitchell, who is a clinical psychologist, and his most recent book is called Time to Breathe. I really enjoyed our conversation together because I think what Bill is able to do so brilliantly is combine all of his academic rigour and research and know-how with his practical experience of working with people all across the world. And he really understands and relates to what we've all been experiencing. So whether that is our blurred boundaries or feeling overwhelmed, or sometimes just feeling like we don't have time for ourselves, he gives us lots of tools and tactics to just improve our resilience in small, specific, and I think really realistic ways. I had to really focus on the conversation to avoid just start to make a bit of a to-do list for myself because he was such a brilliant person to listen to. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. I'll be back at the end to let you know who else you can listen to as part of the series.
Okay, so what is resilience? Essentially, it's a balancing system. If you think about all the pressures that you're under, from your job, from your home life, the pandemic pressures, the disruption, dislocation, uncertainty, and so on. And if we also think about how we pressurize ourselves, conscientiousness and commitment and perfectionistic tendencies, and all of those things, it's a huge mixture of pressures. And essentially, we need a balancing system that's as strong or stronger than those pressures. And that essentially is what I see resilience as being. There are some misconceptions about it. I think one big misconception is that many people treat it as a quality they've got. You might ask somebody, look, how did you cope last year? And they'll say something vague like, well, I'm just a resilient person. Now, that doesn't explain anything, but I don't see it as a quality. I see it as a collection of things we've learned to do. Through all the challenges and disruptions of our lives, we've learned ways of dealing with those challenges and we internalize them. And that collection of skills becomes a resilient system.
So let's talk about those skills, because in some ways, listening to what you've just said, I think is reassuring for all of us, because I think you've sort of debunked the myth that either it's something we have or we haven't got. Anytime I hear that something is a skill, I feel, okay, well, it might be hard to do, but at least I can learn and I can practice and I can hopefully improve my resilience based on the way that you've just described it. And I assume it's something that we also need to continue to invest in rather than feel like we've ticked that box now. So perhaps let's talk about the skills first, and then this idea of, do you need to continually commit to it, perhaps even when times are not hard?
So just looking at what the skills are and the need to continue to invest in it is absolutely right. Because if we treated it as a collection of skills rather than as a quality, we would just be curious about it. And we'd be keen to add more skills. And we wouldn't just let them drift away when life becomes more demanding. So the way I see the skills are that they organize themselves into a system. And I think that you could almost visualize it as a set of building blocks with practical things inside each building block. And I really urge people, if they're about to go into something in life that's just new in some way, like moving house, changing job, moving country, taking on a new role in an organization, anything that's going to be more pressurizing, just think about the system of resilience building blocks and try and have that in place so you're dealing with those changes proactively. But to look at some of the skills, I mean, I also think that everything interconnects. So, for instance, how we look after ourselves physiologically influences how we feel mentally. Ordinarily, when people think about mental well-being, they think of some abstract concept which is not physical, but actually the whole thing interconnects. So there is a physiology that underpins mental energy, mental well-being, happiness, how we adapt to demanding jobs, how we deal with a crisis, and so on. And understanding a little bit about that physiology and then doing a few things that protects that physiology just keeps us in a better state of mental well-being. Now, that's where the no surprises on that list. Things like some physical activity, ways of decompressing, winding down, which for some people is yoga, Pilates, meditation. But for other people, are things like cooking, listening to music, playing with your kids, reading a novel before bed, just the natural ways of winding down. Trying to get good quality sleep, 7 to 8 hours is ideal. Even your diet has an impact on mental well-being. There's such a thing as an antidepressive diet. So really focusing on a good, well thought through diet, keeping alcohol low, moderate, all of these things linked to the physiology that underpins good mental well-being and resilience. But also our interconnections with people. And we've been dislocated for months from friends, from family. Some people have been dislocated inside relationships and they've suffered as a consequence. But people give us support, they acceptance, they jog us out of a bad mood, they make us laugh. And there's really interesting evidence that laughter is as effective as exercise when it comes to underpinning the physiology of mental health. So maintaining good quality relationships and any core relationship we're in, because again, that correlates with stronger resilience, lower incidence of depression, a better immune system, and even performing better in really demanding jobs. Everything interconnects. But basically, one tip would be, regardless of how busy you are, try to do something for you every day out of that list. And one thing I kind of try and urge people to think about is there anything that you just anchor? Something if you drift away from it, you'll suffer in some way. Your mood might drop, you might get more irritable, confidence might drop, and anchor them. Treat them as not negotiable. And that could be exercise, it could be sleep, it could be your diet. But if there's one thing that's non-negotiable in the system, then some things might drift, but the key ones won't.
I wondered if you could just talk to us a bit about the people that you surround yourself with and the impact that has on your resilience.
And that feeling about being overwhelmed and how we cope when we get overwhelmed. I think it's useful to distinguish between being overloaded and overwhelmed. Because when we're overloaded, essentially we've got too much to do, but we still feel in control. And when we're overwhelmed, we've lost control. And it's a feeling of loss of control that gives rise to the emotional reaction. That's when we start to panic. That's when we look at the list and we've no idea where to start. We just feel mentally paralyzed and it gets all too much. So the essence in being overwhelmed is to recognize the loss of control and focus more on the control piece rather than just focusing on how much you've got on. So now part of that could be to have a really good conversation with somebody who's helpful and who understands the kind of work you do. You need to be selective here. A conversation with your boss could be really helpful because you could negotiate demands. You could really clarify what priorities matter and what don't. You could look at ways of doing things maybe more pragmatically rather than trying to do everything perfectly. You could look at who could do something else for you. The whole delegation potential opens itself up here. So a good conversation with somebody who really understands your work can be very helpful in giving you a sense of greater controllability. You can have a conversation with somebody who doesn't understand it, and then the conversation can be really frustrating because then it can go to, well, you've just got to tell your boss you've got too much on. You're being taken advantage of here. You should just leave at 5 and let them get on with it. Now, that kind of conversation is no help, but could actually make you feel worse So really pick your people carefully. And you want the ones who will give you a greater sense of controllability rather than the ones who will just make you feel more helpless. The role of the team leader, the role of the manager for the resilience of the team is something I'm really interested in. I think it can make a huge, huge impact on people's mental well-being, but also on the effectiveness and the productivity of the teams. Because every manager creates their microculture. You know, anybody working in an organization lives in the big culture of the organization. But that's a total abstraction. But what is very real is the microculture that's created by the person who leads your team. Now, some microcultures are incredibly healthy. Some are totally toxic, and they can be under the same umbrella. If a manager was to think, what kind of microculture am I creating for my team? For their health, for their well-being, for their psychological well-being, but also for their effectiveness in this job. Then they could start thinking about, what do you encourage? How supportive are you when people are visibly struggling with the demands? Look out for early red flags that somebody in your team is just drifting away from the good place in the continuum and looking more tired out, struggling with demands, maybe close to being emotional, maybe more irritable than usual, maybe more withdrawn than normal. Those are all indications that this person might be struggling with demands. Check in on that. Check in on how people are feeling. Make it safe for people to have honest conversations if they're struggling with work demands, difficult people, struggling with reaching their targets or whatever. And be proactive about it. Say things like, look, you've got a lot on right now. You're dealing with some really difficult projects. How are you? How are you coping with all this? To get good conversations going about this. You can also coach people, you know, as a good manager. You might see people who are just not that good at prioritizing, or others who are making themselves just constantly available to emails that they don't need to be responding to right at this moment. You can give them guidance. You can give them permission on how they can balance their lives better and clarify the ambiguities. You know, if you as a manager, for instance, just decide to send out a pile of emails on a Sunday, that doesn't mean you need an answer on a Sunday, but you may well need to clarify that because insecure people will respond on a Sunday. If you as a manager work on your holidays, you're setting a major signal that if you want to get on in this organization, you've got to work on your holiday. But actually, if you can have conversations that clarify all of this, people can have a better life. And that's very supportive.
From all of the research that you've done and the work that you do, is there a consistent kind of biggest barrier that is getting in our way from being more resilient?
One of the biggest things we're up against is guilt. It's very easy to feel guilty if you're not doing more to tick things off the list. And that could be at work or at home. So making yourself a priority can generate guilt. You can feel guilty if you go for a walk at lunchtime. We can feel guilty if we go to bed early because we could be working later. We could feel guilty if we're going on holiday and we're not checking our emails throughout the day. Guilt is a huge headwind. And I think the way to deal with guilt is to recognize that in the examples I'm giving, guilt is a mental habit. It's not justified guilt. And I think the way to deal with this is that it's back to the point about everything being connected. If you are to be at your best in a really demanding job, if you're going to be effective and energized for your job, for your people, for your home life, you just have to invest some time taking care of you. If you neglect you, everything else will drop away.
So thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you'll agree that it's a very strong start to our new series, and I can't wait to share the rest of them with you. Next, you're going to hear Helen talk to Eel, who is an expert in distraction and our distraction downfalls and how we can stop them getting in our way. So I think that'll be a really fascinating discussion. And You Coach You is of course out now, so please do grab a copy if you've not already and you think it might be helpful for you in your career this year. There are more than 50 ideas for action, 100 Coach Yourself questions and loads of tools to try out. If you want to develop in a new direction, if you want to think about your progression, build your belief, invest in your resilience reserves, improve the quality of your relationships, our book, we hope, is here to help. And we would love you to support and share our work. We really do appreciate it, and it's how more people discover us. So if you are reading a copy, we'd love you to send us pictures, and it's also really nice for us to see our work making it out into the world. So you can find us at AmazingIf on Instagram, or please do connect with us on LinkedIn. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the series.